A man cast out by kings, the warrior feared by his own people, yet a pioneer who carved life from the ice. Was Erik the Red a ruthless outlaw, driven by rage and blood, or a visionary explorer who saw beyond the world's edge? Tonight, we unravel the truth and the myth of fire and frost. The wind was never gentle in the north. It came howling across the fjords, cold as iron, sharp as a blade. In Norway of the 10th century, men lived and died by steel, by honor, and by the fickle mercy of the sea. This was a time when law was written not in ink, but in blood. Disputes over land ended with axes, and the weight of a man's word was measured in how long he could hold a sword before his arm gave out. It was in this harsh world that a child was born to Thorvald Asfaldsson, a man who himself carried the mark of exile. Thorvald had been driven from Norway, condemned for killings that left blood on his hands and shame on his name. The family fled westward, carried across stormy seas to Iceland, where outcasts and wanderers tried to build new lives at the edge of the known world. The boy's name was Erik Thorvaldsson. One day, the world would remember him as Erik the Red. From the beginning, he was unlike others. His hair was a fiery blaze, the color of fresh blood, as though the gods themselves had marked him for a fate of violence and renown. And just like his father before him, Erik would learn that exile and anger were the companions carved deepest into his bloodline. As a child in Iceland, Erik grew among stories of survival. Winters lasted longer than patience, and the sea claimed more lives than the sword. His mother taught him resilience, how to milk a goat in the cold, how to mend a cloak with stiff fingers. His father taught him something else, that survival sometimes meant fighting harder than the next man, striking before another could strike you. By the time he grew into manhood, Erik was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard as red as the hair that fell past his shoulders. His temper was just as fierce. The sagas tell of disputes that rose suddenly, flaring like sparks in dry grass. A careless insult, a grazing cow that strayed across property lines, a quarrel over driftwood washed ashore. Any of these could end in blood. And when Erik was involved, blood usually did flow. But was this truly rage without cause? Or simply the way of men in a land where law was fragile and survival cruel? Historians still debate it. The sagas, written centuries later, may have sharpened his image into something darker, bloodier than reality. Yet among his neighbors, the whispers grew. Erik Thorvaldsson was not a man to cross. One feud in particular sealed his fate. It began, as so many feuds did, with land. A neighbor named Thorgest claimed timber that Erik believed was his. Harsh words escalated into harsher blows. Axes were raised. Shouts rang across the Icelandic fields, and when the snow settled, men lay dead. The kin of the slain demanded justice. The Althing, the great assembly of Iceland, where free men gathered to pass judgment, was called upon. Picture the scene. A wide-open field, a ring of chieftains cloaked in fur, their breath rising in the cold morning air. Around them, the people of Iceland gathered, waiting to hear how the law would fall. Erik stood among them, his red hair glowing like a torch against the gray skies. He did not bow his head. He did not beg for mercy. When the judgment came, it was clear and final. Outlawry. For 3 years, Erik was banished. He could not remain in Iceland, nor could he seek protection from law or kin. To stay was to invite death at the hands of those who had lost sons and brothers. To leave was to wander once more, as his father had, chased by fate across the sea. Outlaw. The word meant more than exile. It meant to live outside society itself, a wolf among men, a shadow driven into wilderness. For some, it was a sentence worse than death. For Erik, it was a wound and a challenge. The sagas describe his anger, his refusal to bend. They speak of a man too wild, too dangerous for the fragile order of Iceland. But listen closer, and another image appears. A man wrestling with the weight of his own bloodied hands, torn between pride and regret. Did he grieve the men he had killed? Or did he see them only as obstacles in his path? The truth, like the sea, remains clouded in mist. Nights in exile brought silence, the kind that makes a man face himself. Erik's thoughts churned like waves in a storm. He remembered his father's exile from Norway, remembered the shame of being driven out, remembered the long nights of hunger and struggle. Would he too, live and die as an outcast? Or was there a place, somewhere, where he could plant his feet without fear of being cast aside? Perhaps it was pride that spoke, perhaps desperation. But in those nights, Erik made a vow. He would find a land no man could drive him from, a place where his word, his axe, and his vision would be law. And so he turned his eyes west, beyond the horizon, into waters few dared to sail. Rumors whispered of land beyond the sea, places glimpsed only by accident, where mountains rose sharp and wild. It was there that Erik would seek his redemption, or his ruin. When the day came, his ship was readied. A long vessel of oak, carved with dragon's head at its prow, its sails patched from years of use. His crew followed not out of loyalty, but out of the promise of adventure and riches. The sea did not welcome them kindly. Storms gathered as though the gods themselves sought to bar his path. Picture the scene. Towering waves crashing like walls, rain slashing across the deck, men clinging to ropes as lightning split the sky. Erik stood at the tiller, soaked to the bone, his red hair plastered to his face, eyes blazing. Where others saw only terror, he saw possibility. The ship groaned, nearly torn apart by the sea. The men cried out, fearing they would vanish beneath the waves. Then, through the mist, through the storm, land. Jagged cliffs rising black against the dawn, glaciers gleaming like silver, fjords yawning open like the mouths of ancient beasts. It was a land untouched, a land waiting. To some, it was desolation. To Erik, it was destiny. His boots struck the rocky shore with a sound that echoed like prophecy. He raised his axe high, water dripping from its edge, and declared the land his own. The outlaw had found refuge, but this was no mere hiding place. This was the first glimpse of a new world. The sagas tell us he named it Greenland, not because it was green, but because he believed men would be more willing to follow him to a fertile-sounding land than to one of ice and stone. Was it deceit? Was it vision? Perhaps both. But in that moment, standing on the cliffs as the storm broke behind him, Erik knew one thing with certainty. His exile had ended. His true story was only beginning. The sea had carried him farther than law ever could. Erik the Red, once a branded outlaw in Iceland, now stood as the master of a new and unclaimed land. Yet discovery was not enough. A kingdom does not rise from cliffs and glaciers alone. It must be built with blood, with faith, and with followers willing to stake their lives on a vision. Greenland, as he had named it, was no paradise. It was a place where mountains wore crowns of ice, where fjords cut deep into the earth like scars, and where the cold seeped into a man's bones until even fire could not chase it away. To most, it was inhospitable, a wasteland at the edge of the known world. But to Erik, it was freedom. Freedom, however, was never meant to be enjoyed alone. He needed people. Settlers. Farmers to till what little soil there was. Hunters to chase the seals and caribou. Craftsmen to mend ships. Women and children to give permanence to the dream. Without them, Greenland would be nothing but an exile's hideaway. And so, Erik returned to Iceland. He was no longer the disgraced outlaw, skulking in shame. He came back as a man who had crossed the stormy waters, who had seen what no other dared to see, who carried with him the promise of a new beginning. The sagas tell us how he spoke to the people of Iceland, his voice as fiery as his hair. He painted pictures with words, describing green valleys where livestock could graze, fertile land ready for settlement, and vast opportunities for those bold enough to follow him. He named it Greenland, Greenland, knowing well that names hold power. Would men follow him to a place called Iceland too? No, but Greenland, that promised life. It promised hope. It was cleverness, yes, but it was also vision. Erik knew the land was harsh, but he also knew men hungered for more than survival. They hungered for ownership, for the chance to carve something of their own from raw earth. And so they listened. They dreamed. And they followed. By the year 985, 25 ships set sail from Iceland, their sails swollen with the summer wind. Families packed their lives into those vessels, tools, livestock, timber, hopes. But the sea, as ever, demanded its due. Of the 25, only 14 ships completed the crossing. 11 were swallowed by storms or turned back, defeated by waves too cruel to endure. Yet even with that loss, hundreds of men, women, and children stepped ashore on Greenland's wild coast. It was not conquest in the sense of spears and slaughter. There were no armies to defeat, no kings to overthrow. Greenland was conquered by endurance, by the swing of an axe into frozen earth, by the construction of turf houses, with walls thick enough to defy the wind, by the birth of children, whose first cries mixed with the howl of Arctic storms. Erik claimed the southwestern fjords, where summers, though brief, were kind enough to allow grass to grow. There he established Brattle, his estate, which became the heart of the eastern settlement. The land was rocky, the soil thin, but cattle grazed on the meadows, sheep and goats thrived on the slopes, and hunters brought seals and fish from the icy waters. Life was never easy. Winter bit hard and long, and hunger was a constant companion. Yet under Erik's leadership, the settlers endured. They built farms of turf and stone, smoke rising from their hearths into the frozen skies. Churches would later rise among them, but at first it was only Erik's presence, fiery, unyielding, that held the settlement together. He ruled with the same iron hand that had driven men to fear him in Iceland. Disputes were settled quickly, often harshly. A man who threatened unity was a danger to all, and Erik did not hesitate to cut down such threats. But alongside his temper was something new: vision. He had carved a community from wilderness. He was not merely an outlaw anymore. He was a chieftain, a founder, almost a king in all but name. The sagas describe him as proud, sometimes too proud. He refused to convert to Christianity when missionaries later came, even as his wife, Exiled, built the first church in Greenland. Erik clung to the old gods, to Odin and Thor, to the traditions that had shaped him. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was loyalty to the faith that had carried him across storms. In him, the old and new worlds clashed. Greenland's population grew. The eastern settlement flourished with scattered farms, and another, the western settlement, took root farther north. In their prime, these colonies may have held 4,000 to 5,000 souls, small in number, yet vast in spirit. They hunted, fished, traded walrus ivory and furs with Europe, and even sent expeditions farther west, glimpsing lands beyond Greenland. But none of it would have been possible without Erik the Red. His exile, his fury, his relentless will, all had driven him to seek this place. Where others saw desolation, he saw a kingdom. Where others saw danger, he saw destiny. Yet the story of conquest is never without shadows. For every farm that thrived, another failed. For every family that endured, another perished in the long winters. Greenland was a harsh mistress, and not all who followed Erik would find the paradise he had promised. But this, too, was part of his genius. He had lured them with hope, and once they arrived, survival bound them to the land. There was no turning back. As Erik aged, his legacy became clear. His children carried his fire forward. Leif Erikson, the most famous, would sail beyond Greenland to the coasts of Vinland, the land we now call North America. The blood of the outlaw became the blood of explorers, carrying Norse footsteps farther than ever before. And yet Erik himself never saw Vinland. His story remained bound to Greenland, the land he had claimed as his own. Some say he died in Brattle, overlooking the fjord where his ships once set sail, surrounded by the people he had gathered from across the sea. Others say the gods themselves called him home, satisfied that his saga had been written in waves and stone. What cannot be denied is this: Erik the Red had transformed exile into empire. In the emptiness of ice, he had carved a legacy that would outlast the cold. Was it conquest? Was it survival? Or was it the dream of a man who refused to let the world dictate his fate? The sagas leave the answer to us. But one truth remains clear. Without Erik, Greenland would have remained only a whisper of rumor, a shadow on the edge of maps. With him, it became the heart of Norse exploration. And so, the outlaw became a founder. The exile became a chieftain. The man cast out by law became the man who carved law where none had existed. Greenland was not merely his refuge, it was his triumph. The years passed like shadows slipping across the Greenland fjords. Erik the Red, once the blazing heart of exile and discovery, grew older. His fiery hair, once as bright as blood against the snow, dulled to the color of rust. His voice, though still sharp, carried the tremor of age. But his spirit, the fire that had carried him across seas, refused to yield. At Brattle, his great estate, the settlers looked to him still. Smoke rose from turf houses, livestock grazed in meadows scraped from stone, and ships came and went, trading ivory and furs with distant lands. To outsiders, it seemed Erik had carved a lasting kingdom. Yet behind the walls of his home, storms brewed, not only in the skies, but within his family, his beliefs, and his heart. The sagas tell of a strange horse, one that threw Erik violently to the ground. Some whispered it was no mere accident. In the old Norse way, such events were omens. Perhaps the gods were warning him. Perhaps fate itself was reminding Erik that even kings of exile must bend before destiny. He laughed it off at first, but the wound lingered, slowing him, weakening him. His wife, Jodhild, had long since turned to the new faith of Christianity. She built a small church near Brattle, a place of prayer where settlers could kneel and whisper to a god Erik did not trust. Erik resisted. He clung to the old gods, the hammer of Thor, the wisdom of Odin, the fierce honor of the Aesir. To him, they had been companions through storms and slaughter. Could he abandon them now, in the twilight of his years? It was more than religion. It was identity. Erik was a man forged in fire and blood. To surrender his gods felt like surrendering himself. And so the divide grew, not only between husband and wife, but within the settlement itself. Some prayed to Christ, others raised horns to Odin. The very foundation Erik had built, a people united against the cold, now risked splintering into factions. Amid this turmoil rose his children. Leif, the quiet one, steady where Erik was fiery. Thorvald, bold and restless. Freydis, fierce as any shield maiden, a daughter with the temper of her father. Each carried something of Erik's flame, yet each burned in a different way. Leif, especially, bore the weight of destiny. He listened to tales from sailors, rumors of land far to the west, beyond Greenland, beyond the edge of maps. He dreamed of setting sail, of discovering shores no Norseman had touched. Erik, despite his pride, felt the sting of time. His body ached. The horse's omen haunted him. He longed to join Leif, to stand once more at the prow of a ship, hair whipped by salt wind, axe ready for whatever waited. But sickness claimed him. As Leif prepared his expedition, Erik fell into fever. The sagas are divided. Some say he died before Leif ever sailed, others that he lingered, watching his son take the path he himself had carved but could no longer walk. Either way, Erik never saw Vinland. He never felt the soil of North America beneath his boots. That destiny belonged to his son. And yet, without Erik, there would have been no Vinland. Exile had driven him to Greenland, and Greenland had given Leif the stepping stone to cross further west. In this way, Erik's fire burned on, not in his own deeds, but in the legacy of those who followed. Still, conflict clung to Erik even in death. His reputation was never simple. To some, he was a ruthless outlaw, a man who killed too easily, who ruled with temper instead of wisdom. To others, he was a visionary, a leader who saw land where others saw only ice, who built life when none had dared. Truth and myth wrapped around him like the sea mist, inseparable, untouchable. In the long winters after his passing, stories spread across the North Atlantic. Around hearth fires, skalds spoke of Erik the Red, the man of flame, the exile-turned-conqueror, the father of explorers. They told of his banishments, his voyages, his battles, his stubborn faith. Some tales made him larger than life, a warrior blessed by gods. Others whispered of his flaws, his rages, his pride. Both were true, and both were myth. The people of Greenland endured, carrying his name as both burden and banner. His children fought, loved, and explored. Leif reached Vinland. Thorvald died in distant battles. Freydis carved her own fierce legend, feared and respected. Through them, Erik's blood sailed farther than even he had imagined. Yet Greenland itself remained his greatest monument. Against all odds, Norse settlers survived there for centuries, raising cattle, trading with Europe, and telling stories of their red-bearded founder. Even when the settlements dwindled, even when the icy silence reclaimed the farms, the memory of Erik lingered in stone foundations and half-forgotten sagas. And so we return to the question, who was Erik the Red? Was he the ruthless outlaw, cast from land after land, his temper forever spilling blood? Yes, the sagas do not hide it. He killed, he feuded, he burned bridges with the same fire that burned in his hair. Was he also the visionary explorer, who saw hope in a frozen wasteland, who led his people across the sea to carve a home at the edge of the world? Yes, without him, Greenland might have remained only a rumor. Without him, Leif would never have reached Vinland. The truth, as ever, lies in both. Erik was a man of contradictions, violent yet inspiring, destructive yet creative. He was the storm and the shelter, the exile and the founder, the outlaw and the chieftain. In the final image, picture him standing at the mouth of Brattle. The sea wind whips his cloak. His hair, though streaked with gray, still burns with fire. Behind him, smoke rises from turf houses. Children laugh, animals graze. Before him, the fjord stretches into icy infinity. He is both alone and not alone, a man both cursed and blessed. The wind carries voices, the cries of enemies slain, the laughter of children saved, the whispers of gods old and new. Erik the Red closes his eyes. His fire has not gone out. It burns now in the land, in his children, in the sagas that will echo long after the ice reclaims the farms. And so, his legacy is not just carved in stone or blood. It is carved in the eternal clash between myth and history, between what was and what we tell, between the outlaw and the visionary. The saga ends, but the fire remains. And now, we ask you, what do you believe? Was Erik the Red a ruthless outlaw, cursed by his temper? Or a visionary explorer, who dared where others fled? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Strike the like button if you felt the storm and fire of his tale. Share this with those who love history and legend. And join us by subscribing for more journeys into the truth and myth of the Viking Age. For the sea may be silent now, but legends never rest.